Welcome to Full Prefrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive function. This podcast is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. So join us as we explore executive function and the science of learning. And now, here's your host, the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome back to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. I'm your host, Sucheta Kamath, and I have been having these conversations time and time about executive function, its impact on life, personal achievement, personal success, and we as humans are, going through life, and one of the biggest sources of novelty or new perspectives and information is reading and gaining perspective on the world through lens of somebody else. And I'm a voracious reader. I was talking to another guest yesterday, and I was like blown away by the data that just got published in December. Gene, I'm wondering if you heard that, which is 50% of Americans read less than one book a year. And if you read more than 10 books a year, then you are 99 percentile, which is what I am. And we have a returning guest who has this incredible, scope of practice, a wealth of knowledge, and he's going to talk about his second expertise today about literacy. And as I think about the topic of literacy, I'm a speech and language pathologist. The bane of my existence is comprehension, oral language, written language, understanding of language, and nonverbal communication, and then producing or communicating through oral communication and written communication. So I have had the blessings of understanding the backdrop. And the last way I would like to tie the topic today is my own journey as a multilingual speaker. And I think those who listen to this regularly have heard this. So I grew up in India and a particular state called Maharashtra, where my mother tongue is Marathi. And my parents were very proud to put their children in Marathi medium. So you could be medium of instruction, could be English. So from kindergarten itself, you learn in English, which is what my husband did, versus you learn your educational journey is through your mother tongue. And I was fortunate enough to do that. What was so interesting, I was a voracious reader. I belonged to a very small community outside Bombay, and there was a public library, and it had 200 books, and I was done. By sixth grade, I was done with those books. So I was starving for information. And I was early on exposed to a lot of literature and poetry and a lot of thought leaders, more like a philosophers than never scientific reading, by the way. So by the time I finished 10th grade, the way Indian education works, we merged our English medium cohort and Marathi medium cohort merged, and we became 40 students instead of, or maybe 60 students instead of 30. And I, who was the topper, really great student, completely plummeted in my academics. I could not keep up with the language of science being taught in English. And I was devastated because I didn't think I was a bad student or I had any academic struggles. And suddenly I found myself. And one of the gaps that I noticed now that I look back is lack of knowledge. I just did not have any exposure to the linguistics or the content or the scientific lingo other than what I had read, which was all philosophy and never science. And all the scientific concepts suddenly were introduced in English. And so as I think about our students and their learning, I often channel my own 11th grader who was in a very pitiful state. And so Gene, my guest today, is going to help me understand how to not feel sorry for myself. And maybe he can use me as his, example that, yes, once knowledge is expanded, and if you channel your attention, your motivation, you too can become very well versed. And I have returned to reading, 2 books a week, and I read more than 50 books a year. So with that said, it's a great honor and privilege and joy to have my guest, Gene Kerns, again, back on the podcast. He is, as I mentioned in the last podcast, but he's a third generation educator with teaching experience from elementary through university level. He also has switched hats. So being directly in front of the students, he has now been in front of those who teach students and those who design programs for students from an administrative perspective. He currently serves as the vice president and chief academic officer of Renaissance Learning, and he has more than 20 years of experience in leading professional development. He speaks nationally. We have been co-presenters at many conferences. I really hope I do some fun things with him. But my greatest joy today is to talk about a specific book that he has co-written with his colleagues, which is called Literacy Reframed. So, by the way, that itself should jog our attention because it's like literacy framed versus reframed. Why? We are going to ask him about that. But also, I think don't turn off if you're not an educator. Like, why do I care about literacy? Because you really should understand the value and importance. If you have somebody who's surveying you, or if you're participating in a survey, or if you're concerned about voting, and if you're concerned about global citizenship, then you should deeply care about literacy. So the book that we are going to discuss is called Literacy Reframed: How to Focus on Decoding Vocabulary and Background Knowledge, because it improves reading comprehension. So welcome to the podcast, Gene.
Thank you, Sucheta. Glad to be back.
So as we do like any podcast, since the topic is about literacy, I'm just curious about your own journey of literacy as a learner. How would you describe yourself as the knowledge seeker?
It would depend on what period of life. What I will say is, as a third generation educator, I mean, here's an example. My middle school used to shorten the periods each Wednesday so we could all have a independent reading period. And that was great. So you got, 30, 45 minutes to read. Now that I look back on it, I realize how supported I was because my family was going to make sure that in my hands was a really good work of young adult literature. Like there was some book at an appropriate level, appropriately challenged, high quality. Sitting on either side of me might have been two kids reading Mad Magazine because either that's what they brought or they didn't bring anything, and so the teacher just grabbed something out of the bin. But I realized that as a third generation educator, I have a lot of members of my family that were going to make sure that I was in summertime too. We used to have quiet time in the summer, and it was 30 minutes. You had to go to your room, and you could take a nap, or whatever, or read. And it went long often, so that 30 minutes turned into. But it didn't matter again because we had books and we liked reading and we were encouraged to read. I will say I did pretty well with that K to 12. But, to your point about the power of wide reading, when I went to college, my first degree was in English education. And I remember, for every literature class that I had, we were expected to read a novel a week. So I was reading well more than I'd ever read before.
Yes.
And that had an extreme impact on on your brain. It's interesting. Everybody's all the chatter about ChatGPT. Large language models. What ChatGPT is going to do, and AI and all this kind of stuff. Think about it. Think about this. ChatGPT does what it does because it's read a lot. That's it. It has read a lot. And so in the same way that we're training large language models to consume massive amounts of information so that they can do things for us and give ideas back, our brains work almost the same way. They need to be fed. The more feeding of massive amounts of information that we give to our brains, the more we're going to be able to do. And it's, you put your finger on it when you said most people. I mean, I don't know the data on the adult levels. I mean, there's a study you're referencing, but here's what I can tell you. We have for more than 25 years seen in our data at Renaissance that students who read for less than 15 minutes a day outside of what's going on with their school expectations, they're falling further and further behind. So 15 minutes is kind of really tipping point.
Wow.
You either are or that's kind of like you're treading water. So 15 minutes is the tipping point, and that's one piece. But then here's the other dynamic. Slightly more than 50% of kids don't read that much each day. So as we're talking,
crazy to me.
I mean, it's like right now, as we're talking, as we're having this podcast, more than half of kids out there aren't reading enough to keep up with rising levels of expectation and performance. And that's as simple as complex as it needs to be. It's an important challenge we've got to solve.
Wow, that's very overwhelming just listening to it, like 15 minutes outside school. So, as you know, it's such a simple thing. I often think about we are so obsessed about inoculating children with vaccines. And we are really not talking about powerful ways to inoculate the brain from
Mhm.
rotting or not growing.
Yeah.
One
Yeah.
place on the body where you want wrinkles is your brain.
Well, and there was a great book, Bauerlein's the author. It's the title is like The Dumbest Generation, subtitle something like Why You Should Never Trust Anybody Under 30. Sorry if I offended anybody listening. But here's the irony that he outlined in the first chapter. He said, at this moment right now, there is more access to text for children than for all of us, but there's more access to text and information than we've ever had in all of the time that human beings have ever been on the earth. And yet, at the same time that access has gone through the roof, in general, students' reading is going down. Um, and those of you that know, our company was founded by a reading product that was invented by Judy Paul. She was our creator. She was a mother. She wanted her kids to read more. And Judy one time was doing a speech, and she said, when she was a kid, she read more books than she could get her hands on. It made me think about that when you said you read all the books in the library. She was in Baxter, Iowa, a tiny little town. And like you, she'd read all the books in the library, and the bookmobile would come every 2 weeks. And she said the problem was she read faster than
The bookmobile.
The bookmobile make it back. So she'd bribe the farm boys with her lunch money. Like she would pay them off to get them to go get the show. She told them what books to get. And, they got their brownies or whatever from her lunch money. But, the whole point was she read as much. And fast forward. So as a child, she's paying off the farm boys to get the books from the bookmobile. When she went off to university, she said at first it was really kind of hard. She was intimidated because here she was from this tiny little community, Baxter, Iowa. She said there were kids who had come from all these big prep schools and all these places. And she said they'd taken courses with titles I'd never even heard of. And she said, I was a little overwhelmed. And she said, but when we got into it, she said, I realized because I'd read a lot, I had a lot of background knowledge. Like I knew these things that we were talking about in class. And she said, even though I was intimidated because I hadn't taken all these courses, what I had done is read a lot.
Huge, yes.
I read a lot. And she's like, for a while, once I'd let the intimidation factor get away, once I could let go of that, I realized I was going to be okay, even though I was from a tiny little town. I read a lot. And again, just like ChatGPT does what it does because it's read a lot, our brains don't work in a very different situation than that.
I just love that story. And I think, again, culture has such a powerful role to play. I grew up in India, as I mentioned. One of the community activity, it was called Katha Kathan, which means storytelling. And this storytelling was a thing that people went for, where an orator gave oration for 2 hours. They were hilarious. They were all about life's journey. These were writers, but who became storytellers. So there's not a stand-up comedy. So this is not really entertaining you as in a traditional sense that somebody standing in the mic, but it is like a whole group of people. So I grew up with two cultural elements that to me have had a very important impact on my brain is reading, which, but literature from many, many perspectives and generations. But second was this kathakathan, this participation in oral language. And I feel now going in a group where you have 100 people in a room listening to oration. It's not political. It's about life, like journey of life,
Mm-hmm.
And I feel that had a really wonderful transmission of what we believe as a culture. What do we believe in terms of our values? What do we consider who should we be as together? And I can't really name any parallel experience because this was not a drama. This was not a one-man show. It was a very cultural thing. So small villages had this, and even like communities had this. So I'm just wondering, as you were mentioning about this impact on the brain, 15 minutes, more than 15 minutes has significant academic impact. I'm wondering if you can, I know we haven't even launched yet, but just this idea about oral language, does that have any merit on developing the brain?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and I think that uh, that's why for some students, that the first part of reading is so easy because we know that if you use the simple view of reading, which is one of the constructs of the science of reading, decoding ability, so word language skills plus the oral language piece. If you have both of those, you get quickly to comprehension. So children who were read to a lot, who heard a lot of words, there's plenty of research about, the variance between kids is on the factor of millions of words when they arrive at school. So some kids are going to walk in with this really robust oral vocabulary. Sitting next to them is going to be another kid who just doesn't have that. When we teach them decoding, that we've taught them the same skills. We've taught them how to associate letters and sounds in English. One kid's off to the races so fast because now they can decode a lot of the words they know. And when they sound out the word, they go, oh, I know that word. I've heard that word before. I know what it means. The kid next to them may be just as proficient as decoding, but when they sound that out and they say, I've never heard that. I don't know what that means. So, a lot of research just talks about the advantages that kids come with or the disadvantages that they come with to school. And clearly exposure to oral language is a major factor that makes a tremendous difference.
And, colloquially speaking, again, like when you grow up in, again, another country, another language, I was very good at idiomatic expression. When I came to US, I had a test that we used to give to patients with brain injury, and it was called RAS information processing test. And it had very peculiar idioms to see if your metaphoric language is impaired or not, your ability to infer and extrapolate. And there was a phrase that said, your eyes are bigger than your stomach. Yep. Now, I was 25 years old. I could not understand why the meaning of that phrase meant you thought you could eat a lot more, or you were deceived by your own system, or whatever the multiple meanings. And so what happened is I was so not proficient in assessing the patient's performance, it was erroneous or not, because it was a learned language. It was not learned idiomatic expression. It's not natural forte. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, what was going on there is the concept of idioms crosses languages, but the actual idioms that we use most often do not. Which means, an English speaker would have heard that, a dozen, 15,
exactly.
20, 30, however many times. You go, oh, I know what that means. You figure it out after a while. But, I'm sure that you could give examples of, idioms from your mother tongue that would make, initially no sense whatsoever to, and again, that has, because really what we did in Literacy Reframed, and we began by saying, well, what is reading comprehension? Like, how do you get there? What are the core elements? We talk about the big three in the book, and part of it is decoding. But then once you can decode, you can associate those letters and sounds. Then what you're talking about is tapping into all that oral language you've heard. And if you've heard a lot, then great. This process is going to go pretty well for you. But for students that have not been read to a lot, not heard a lot, which is why we also advocate in the book reading to kids every day. We are, as human beings, we're all pre-wired by learning to learn language by hearing it spoken. And so I was that crazy high school senior English teacher that read to my students every day. Now, what the research said, well, two things. I did it for two ways. One, the research says is read to kids about 2 grade levels ahead of what their tested reading level is. So you'd read things to them that they couldn't access. Now the problem is it changes as kids age. Somewhere in late middle school, 7th or 8th grade, generally speaking, when we're younger, our listening vocabulary is more advanced than our reading vocabulary, which makes perfect sense. Those things start catching up. So somewhere at about 7th or 8th grade for most kids, they become, in terms of text complexity, they become equal. So some people say, well, what does that mean we don't read to older kids? Absolutely not. I read to them genres that were different, things from different time periods, things that required more background knowledge or information, because, one of the ways we measure text is, a lexile level or text complexity level, but that only tells part of it. Those measures do not consider your background knowledge. Point being, if we handed you an advanced text on parts of India, you got a lot more background information than a lot of people listening to us today, which means you'd have no problem with that text. Someone that never lived there, has never visited there, has never studied there, they would not be able to read that same text. And it has nothing to do with our general reading ability. It has to do with our background knowledge, which was another major theme for us in the book that we were adamant about talking about, because not enough people talk about how knowledge contributes to reading ability.
So it brings me to this question. So I love the framing that you reframed, is really bringing attention to decoding as a foundational skill.
Yep.
I like to call it what attention is to executive function, gateway to information processing. But once you got the decoding, like sound symbol relationship, then comes the idea of vocabulary. Do you understand nuggets of the lexicon, the units of information that carry bundle of information about it? But that vocabulary without the context is really not really going to propel you through the like a rocket, which is knowledge. Why did you even have to propose that? Like, isn't that the bane of bloody reading?
Well,
teaching reading?
It is and it isn't. And I think it comes to two things: priorities, nuances of messages. I mean, let's face it, people don't deal with nuances well. So when I talked about the big three of reading comprehension, we've named them, and you and I've referenced them, but you and I've read the book. So let's just lay it out for listeners.
Yes.
Part number one, decoding. Like, you have to be able to associate letters and sounds. Part number two, vocabulary. That, like, when you sound out the word, you actually have to have heard it. You need to know what it means and have, meaning that you can bring to it. Part number three is knowledge. Well, let me back up a little bit. Please don't, anyone who reads my book or hears me, don't let anything that I say be perceived as putting down the phonics skills. They are absolutely important. They are the foundation. But you don't live in a foundation, you live in a house. Okay, so once we have the phonics... That's
a great analogy.
Yeah,
yes.
Once we have the phonics skills in place, we have to add on top of it. Because again, I can take a kid and I can teach them phonics to a mastery level. But if they sound out a word using those skills that I taught them and they've never heard the word before, they are no closer to comprehension. That's where the vocabulary piece comes in. So we teach as many vocabulary words, but then there's also this nuance of knowledge that if somebody says to you, oh, that was a Trojan horse. Well, I hope somebody taught you some mythology somewhere, because you're not going to understand Trojan horse or Herculean effort. Or if someone in a passing effort looks at her and says, oh, that was her Waterloo moment. Well, I hope you learned enough, history to understand a reference to Napoleon there and a great defeat, or Half-Life, litmus test. What's your litmus test for that, Sucheta? Well, there's vocabulary that came from science class, and that's the whole point. In addition to learning to decode, in addition to needing to learn vocabulary, we also need certain general names and dates and places and references that come from all of the content areas and from the arts. And the more you have read, and ideally the more widely you have read, the more names and dates and places and references you will understand. And then it just opens up. And here's also the difference, and I'll stop talking for a second, but this is so important to me. There are 44 phonemes in English. We are not creating any new ones. So once a kid has mastered all 44, they are done. There's nothing else to ever learn that will improve your literacy after that. Now, again, I'm saying you got to learn them. They're really important, because English, the way that this language was formed, there's a boatload of irregularities. That said, you're done learning your phonemes probably by the time you're in third grade. For the entirety of your life, you will always have the capacity to learn new vocabulary and new knowledge. Your whole life. It never stops. I could always learn a new word. I could always learn new content. And new words and new content also make me a more literate person. So it's all got to be taken, it's a more holistic view perhaps on literacy than sometimes we allow ourselves to have.
Wow. Well, first, your passion comes through, and thank you for being so emphatic, because sometimes I think, again, I appreciate now why you're saying reframing, because we can get into the weeds and forget the big picture. So you're bringing us, particularly educators, back to the bigger picture, which is don't forget the starter kit, but then keep adding fuel, because this is a motor that needs to run. And as more it runs... Go ahead.
And it's two parts. We had to reframe because we needed to get the whole picture. But let's also be honest. And one of the reasons we titled it Literacy Reframed is because what we're doing right now isn't working. I mean, the results, look at the results. It's just not working. So we must reframe literacy because we're working too hard to get income or to get outcomes that are not substantial or enough. Too many kids below proficiency, too low levels of literacy. It needs to be reframed because what we're doing right now is just not paying the dividends that we need as a society.
It's so interesting as you say, my adult experience, in spite of being a voracious reader, not in English, but then have trained myself. I'm very slow in English reading. So it's really painful for me. I tend to move to, audiobooks. I'm much faster.
Yeah, you would be. Yeah, I mean, that's perfectly
But my lexicon is very diverse. It's interesting though, Jean, you will be shocked. It was yesterday or Monday, there was some podcast that I was listening to that they used the word caucus, caucusing. And I just had never thought that caucus is a verb, or first of all, I don't understand that word at all. Mm-hmm. So I keep my definition next to me, which says, it's a parliamentary party, but it always caucus to me sounds like cocky. So I'm still confused, like what the word to be understood. Yeah. Iowa caucus. So I've understood some random word, but it's empty. I just struggle as a full-grown person with vibrant brain to understand the full meaning. I just cannot even imagine what must happen to kids when they're left to make meaning with words. They're randomly appearing or robustly appearing, and they have no idea what to make of it to make cohesive meaning. It must be a Swiss cheese of information processing.
Well, it is, and I mean that's why we're always measuring book levels and considering the text that we're giving young kids. But here's the deal: that's a controlled environment. We're preparing kids to go out into an uncontrolled environment called the world, where their boss or their employer or whatever expectation may hand them any text, and the assumption is you're going to read it and understand it. Now, your vocabulary piece, let's add a little research there. Again, please don't anybody think I'm putting down the phonics skills have to be there. And we know more about the role of phonics-based instruction to support a student in learning English than anything else. And it's an unquestionable research base. But let's talk about the vocabulary piece. Do you know what percentage of unknown words a reader can tolerate in a text? And that's the pain you were pointing to, Sucheta. Some people say, well, maybe 10, 15% unknown words. No, 2%. 2%. You might find an author that would go as high as 5%. And even though every state in this country has said, here's what I call it the ubiquitous standard. It's everywhere. Every state wrote an educational standard that said students will use context clues to determine the meaning of unknown words. Now, everybody expects kids to do that. What no one tells a teacher is how much context do you have to have? 98%. Much more than 2% unknown words, and our frustration goes through the roof. Our level, and eventually we just disconnect because it becomes mentally overloading, and people, we can't do it because we're all verbal here. I have visual examples of text that one of my colleagues created, a third grade passage, where she obscured 5% of the most advanced words. And when I put it in front of a room full of highly credentialed people, they will all agree they don't fully understand what's happening in the text. So we've got to be able to decode. We have that skill as foundational. We've got to have it there. We've got to know the vocabulary words, and we don't deal well when there's many unknown words. And then even when we can decode the words, sometimes we need those knowledge pieces so that, again, if someone says to you, oh, Berlin Wall, maybe there's a city called Berlin, and maybe you assume the Berlin Wall is a wall in Berlin, but that is not sufficient to understand the reference, the historical significant reference that someone is making when they say the Berlin Wall and the story that it associates there. So, Daniel Willingham, major cognitive scientist.
He's been a guest on our podcast, and I see that he's come multiple times, but you talk a lot about his work too, which I appreciate.
Yes, he's huge in here, but what he says is, writers don't explain everything when they write a text. They assume that they can just drop in something like Berlin Wall. And they're not going to have a footnote that explains the Berlin Wall was a major dividing line that divided East and West Germany post World War II. They're just going to say Berlin Wall and assume that the readers understand. And you either do or you don't, which either means within that text you will be literate or illiterate. And those are the decisions that knowledge is making. And that's part of the equation as well. So the big three, again, for us are decoding plus vocabulary plus knowledge. If you're good on all three factors, you're going to comprehend. And if any one of those factors is lacking, then comprehension will be compromised.
So I think the question really is, and for the purpose of tying executive function to these three aspects, like even the way I see self-regulation in knowing when you have failed to achieve your goals is a very powerful way how we activate our executive function to rein in our goal attainment, right? Like maybe I'm not getting it. Even that awareness is very critical precursor to changing the course in comprehension or changing the course in producing academic performance. So the question I had was about the particular area of knowledge, which we have been talking a lot about. How can teachers I see a chicken and an egg phenomenon often described in the context of educators getting very frustrated when they don't see the results, particularly fourth grade reading or seventh grade reading, that they consider certain kinds of aspects of knowledge to be a precursor to their ability to teach. And they don't lead with sometimes, and I may be wrong about this, you know more about this, they don't check what's the knowledge base to know where they should begin, or what should I do to upscale your knowledge context or knowledge base. So you're not just inferring and extrapolating based on little crumbs that may be left without really Trojan horse, I can maybe infer it's a horse. But if I'm culturally sensitive, then I may know Trojan is a condom brand, So I'm completely derailed at this point, right? So what is getting what can educators do or think about when it comes to one, doing something specific to improve the students' knowledge so they don't become the primary provider of the knowledge, but they make the students seeker of the knowledge to bridge the gap in comprehension?
Well, I think there's two parts there. I mean, one, what do we do curricularly to spell it out? We use the words explicit and systematic around phonics instruction. And the reason that those words have lingered is that's the words that were used in the National Reading Panel report, where the body of research came forward and said we need explicit and systematic phonics-based instruction. I believe, and I can't take credit for it, I don't remember exactly who penned this one, but I read an article the other day that said in the same way that we attempt to be explicit and systematic around teaching phonics, we also need to be equally explicit and systematic about teaching knowledge. If we know that there are numerous references to Greek mythology that people will be expected to understand when they graduate school. Well, who's going to teach mythology? Like where? What grade are we going to assign it to? What are we going to cover? If we know that there's certain names and dates and places of reference from history, when are those things covered? Do we spell them out explicitly or do we leave them for chance? That is why you are seeing more and more, and Natalie Wexler wrote about this in her book, The Knowledge Gap.
She's been a guest too.
Yeah, you've got an all-star guest list there. But that is why you're seeing more curricula like the CK Core Knowledge Language Arts curriculum that says, here is our reading curriculum, and it is also a sequenced order of knowledge building. So one part is we can spell out the general knowledge and do a good job with that, because we want to say, okay, what are the names and dates and places or references that when a kid finishes school we expect them to know, so that we're sending them in the world with a high level of general literacy. The other thing, when you say executive function, I mean, you're talking about kids that are also motivated. How do we make kids desirous of even more information? Because I mean, at one level I'm saying, well, I want to guarantee this base threshold for all kids, but then I also hope to unleash kids to be consumers of information. And it's not like you're going to have a kid that's going to learn every term in science and every term in math and every term kids are going to get interested in certain things. How do I excite them to dive into topics, to read more widely about them, to go deeper? And we didn't get to that point extensively. We had some elements in the book, but I remember years ago Howard Gardner at Harvard said, we don't let kids deal with any one topic long enough to become
Yes.
any kind of expert. We're on to the next one. Cover. And other people have said that sometimes our coverage is an enemy to understanding. How do we balance that? The balance that we have to cover a lot of topics, but also when are the opportunities for a kid to dwell on something and go deep? Because it's when you really start connecting some ideas, when you've been working on a topic and learning some things in school, and then you turn on the TV and it shows up on the History Channel. I mean, I remember my kids running in the door one morning, Mr. Kerns, I was watching this show last night, and, they brought up this topic or that topic that we were talking about. When kids see something that they've been learning in the school actually out there in the world. I mean, the best ones are when the kids have learned something and their parents are talking about something, and then they can contribute to the contribution or to the conversation.
So amazing.
It's that balancing that I don't know there's an easy way to achieve. Yeah, we got a lot of general stuff we need to cover and kids need to learn, but also to how then do we shift gears every now and then to dwell on a topic or a theme? And I love some of the integrated units that people do where they connect a theme either throughout an entire year, and they have through lines through their course, or where the school, identifies a theme that for a marking period, topically everybody's connecting to as they could. The brain is always seeking to connect new learning to what it already knows. And if we can spell out things in a thematic way for kids, we're making it more likely that it'll be sticky and compelling and come together for them.
And I'll tell you, to your point, I think you were probably one of the students' favorite teachers. Just like your teaching style, I think I had a fantastic literature teacher in my 10th and 11th grade. And he literally used to read out loud, which no other teacher, I would say after, not even in middle school, read out loud to us. Mm-hmm. And he was a little bit, temperamental, but he would sit on the desk. He would have his book in his hand, and he would read a sentence, and it would look like he has taken a swig of his best scotch. I mean, of course, I'm using this very Western reference, which nobody was drinking, but and he would just say, "Isn't this beautiful?" Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we were like, oh my God, there he goes again, like loving words, And what he did, though, he would take something very poignant and pause, and a piece of literary ways the author has expressed, and just say like how beautiful it is, as good as watching a sunrise. And of course, I look back at that, even though I thought like, can you just go faster so we can get more of you? But I also appreciate one thing about that he was one of my only teacher who actually demonstrated he being in love with reading.
Mm-hmm. And the words and the language. And
the language, the words, the drama, the sentiment, the joy, its capacity to influence him as a human. He kept talking about it. And imagine 2 years of that, you just become that kind of person. He romanticized the learning of deep meaning making. It was just really profound. I thought it was beautiful.
And I two things that came to mind there. One, I really, and I'm probably a little bit biased by my background, which was I was trained in classical debate. So we did a lot of debate and forensics in high school. So when you talked earlier about the reading aloud, I heard the forensics competitions. But I also think for secondary kids, argumentation, like getting them to go deep into topics, to consider both sides of issues, I think those could be powerful motivators to develop critical thinking on the part of kids, and to want them or to encourage them to go deeply into topics. So that was one thing I wanted to put. I think particularly in secondary, argumentation is a powerful tool that we just don't avail ourselves. And there's a great Greenhaven Press has a series called Opposing Viewpoints. And they take the very issues that kids are hearing in the news, and they have essays on either side. And I remember one time reading an essay with kids, and we read the essay on one side, and then right after we read the essay on the other side, and this kid named Reggie raised his hand. He said, "Mr. Kerns, I don't get it." I said, "Well, what do you not get?" He said, "I don't get it. We just read one argument or one author that said one thing, and we just read another author that said something else." And I said, "Reggie, welcome to the adult world. Things are not black and white. They're shades of gray." But here's the other thing I want to say too is, you talked about your teacher reading to you. I firmly believe that in every classroom, there's 3 kinds of reading that ought to occur. Reading to kids, reading with kids, and creating time for kids to read independently. I want to read to kids things that are 2 grade levels ahead of where they are, or sometimes I would read the first chapter of a book the kids could read just for motivational purposes. Like you read the first chapter and you put it down and you tell them if they want to know where the story goes, they've got to pick it up and read it themselves. So I read to my kids every day. Most of what I do instructionally is reading with kids. Teachers don't throw the textbook at kids and say, read it cover to cover and get back with me. That's where we do the pre-reading, and that's where we do the deep questions and the think alouds and the modeling and all that kind of stuff. And that's most of what we do in language arts classroom. But we also need that independent reading time, that we want kids to read things of their own choice beyond what we're doing in school. Maybe they're related, maybe not related, maybe it's just for pleasure. If every day, and we're really good at the reading with kids. I mean, there's your instructional piece. We're pretty good there. We're not nearly as good as reading to them every day and creating dynamics for them to read on their own every day. If we could add those 2 elements, I think we'd move the needle substantially in what's going on in terms of our literacy outcomes.
And if I can add to this point of, how these are foundational processes through which you talked about critical thinking, brain evolves to become a master of higher order thinking.
Yes.
My favorite researcher, Robert Sapolsky, talks one of the coolest ways he presents information about how the brain functions became adaptive. You had ancient systems that were designed to perform a particular function, and reading, by the way, we were not designed to read.
Not
we
at
were not
all.
designed to write. And so these are evolutionarily new skills. But the brain had, so he talks about this, he has a quote, he says, in order to handle metaphor, when we humans transitioned from being a species that could merely handle sensory disgust to handling moral disgust, we took the insular cortex, and it expanded its portfolio to include both the literal and metaphorical versions of things. And that's why it has trouble distinguishing the 2 at times. And one of the greatest research, indulge me if you don't mind, the researchers studied this. What they did is they wanted to present this United States policy about what is our view about letting people come in, people from other countries. And what they did, they created 2 conditions, okay? In condition 1, they had people read a paragraph before they read the policy. And the paragraph was about invasive pathogens, okay? And the second group received a paragraph that was neutral. And guess what? The minute those people who read the invasive pathogens paragraph, how body is invaded with pathogens, it attacks, it destroys, and then they were given a policy about immigration. So they actually had a negative viewpoint on immigration. So when you talked about this exercise of presenting your student with 2 different contradictory viewpoints, it is a way we are training your insular cortex to say, if this is true, I believe this. Wait, how can this also exist? And what do I do with this conflict that I'm experiencing? And that's resolving this conflict of 2 opposing viewpoints is really leads to reduction in cognitive dissonance. And those who do this work, which is what executive function training is all about, is I am learning to tolerate the conflict that this can be true while this too can be true. And I need to kind of form a very wide range of opinions.
Yeah. Well, and there was another, which I always thought was a very truthful statement as well, that people would make in the debate community. And it went like this. Unless you understand your opponent's arguments, you do not fully understand your own.
I love that. Yes.
Or until you understand your opponent's arguments, you do not fully understand your own. So it's also that idea of, like an unquestioned belief is not a particularly strong belief. So, and that's what debate, I think, was so good. And again, you can see I'd built an entire secondary experience for kids wrapped around argumentation and debate and, researching around both sides of the issue, because I just don't think that there's anything that encourages kids to, read information more or to think more critically about the world and the things that they are studying there. But it is, and there was another image too of, when you were debating issues like that, you are polishing your brain against the brains of others.
I
And I
love
like that
that.
idea of, that friction and burnishing,
I love
of our
that.
brains, that like we don't ever really get to the deep understanding of what we believe or how the world works or what the tensions are unless we're willing to step into that space and take issues and look at both sides of them and understand what the arguments are. And that's tough space to be in sometimes, but boy, does unquestionably the precipitant of that is critical thinking and a deeper understanding.
And here, you probably get this. I get this a lot. How do we improve student engagement is the top question I hear, which is motivational management.
Yeah.
And second is, how do I get my students to care about or interest, basically? How do I cultivate interest in something that, and to me, that, introduction to expansive background, like if you are introducing concepts that are too great above their capacity right now, you're challenging them. Don't be afraid to, by challenging, you are diminishing their ability to engage. In fact, that may activate. But also, I think, to me, it's a way of honoring students' intelligence and saying, hey, you are a student by definition, which means you're in the process of learning. And since you don't know what you're learning, you will learn when you begin to learn. So I'm never afraid of this idea of you haven't known something. That is because you haven't learned something. And the cultural context can be set as well.
Yeah.
So as you think about, you kind of alluded to this idea of they're digital natives who actually are born with an iPad or their parents' digital technology, right? And so research is kind of quite jarring that when you read with using physical material, like a printed paper, your comprehension is better. So it was interesting. Daniel Willingham, who was talking about study strategies, and he says the research doesn't say that if you took handwritten notes, there's any difference in what you consider important or what you're processing, but the act of physically doing it improves your ability to come back to something that's much more concrete that you can evaluate, that you have interacted with. So I do feel, so what is your worldview about, number one, all information is available to anybody if you care to read. I mean, we are right now signing agreements and privacy policies without reading them. So I have not much hope. I read somewhere that the policymakers' language is, or the highest vocabulary is under 8th grade. So what are we doing? What should we aim for? What's a reasonable expectation of digital natives?
Well, I mean, I think so. You're referencing. We did have a section on there about reading
Exactly.
in the digital world, and so a couple of things. One, the research is pretty clear. Kids tend to say they enjoy reading digitally more than paper sometimes. What we know is shorter things to read, like an article. It doesn't really matter whether that's a digital format or print format. People's performance on what they comprehend is pretty on par. It's when you read longer works, and not just for pleasure. So if you want to just pick up a novel and read it digitally, that is fine. In fact, a lot of kids who, aren't readers, just the fact that they don't see that there's, there 400 pages to go, they do a little bit better. What I'm talking about is like that deep, close reading, the kind where in the end, you're going to have to answer an open-ended question, and that question is going to require you to use evidence from what you read in building your case. Much more than about, and I think the metric was somewhere near 800, 1,000, 1,500 words, something like that. Much more than that. That's where, when kids are reading digitally, things do start dropping off. And I think we sometimes feel this as adults, but we wonder, well, is it different for the kids? That idea of, when I would highlight in my Kindle and try to go back and find something, I couldn't find it as easily as if I highlighted it in a paper book. Like I remembered, it's about a third of the way through the book on the right side, up towards, like my brain had stored that somehow.
That's a serial encoding, yes.
And those reference points were just completely lost when it was the digital text. So one of the things that we talked about is, it's critical that, one, and there was a series of D's in there. So like digital is different, digital is decided. And what we talked about was there is so much information that's in digital format that, like, whether you're going to do that or not, we're not going to say, we're not going to do digital. It just has to be on paper. That's not going to work in our world right now. But we do need to acknowledge that it's different. We have to teach kids how to deal with it. So highlighting tools, annotating tools, those things are all very, very powerful. If I see a tool that's got those and an online reading tool that does not have those, then for our students, I definitely want to go. And at Renaissance, we have a digital platform that provides books, 70% informational text, 30% literature. And what's in there is we've got all the annotating tools. And that's because we know the research that says you got to have that kind of stuff. So I think we just have to teach kids how to read digital text, and that reading something digitally is different from reading something in a paper format, and particularly that this is when you are the most exposed to having a challenge by going with a particular platform or not.
So this probably may not sit well with you, but I'm just curious what your thought about things like Blinkist. Have you heard of this? Is a new app that summarizes the book, How to Appear Intelligent at a Dinner Party. So they take famous books and they make them bite-sized.
We call those Cliff Notes or Reader's Digest back when I was a kid. I mean, you had the same thing. I'll read the Cliff Notes, or, I mean, my mother subscribed to Reader's Digest for years. That was a summary of major books. And basically, I mean, the hope was by reading the summary, you'd say, well, I want to go read the full book. So, I mean, I know,
but this whole idea of looking smart without doing the work, like, I'm against that.
Oh, people have been doing that for decades, whether we have the technology or not. There's not, I mean, in fact, I had my 11th grade English teacher. I swear to her name was Mrs. Pickles, and we loved Mrs. Pickles. She was great, Mrs. Angie Pickles. And her response, if we ever said, Mrs. Pickles, when are we ever going to need this? She would say, cocktail chatter, dear, cocktail chatter. So anything which couldn't fit in, it was cocktail. Someday at a dinner party somewhere, you're gonna reference this, and it's gonna be meaningful.
Well, I've been so enthralled by this discussion, and really, I think the point for me that has stuck out is nothing is going to happen differently unless there's some deliberate effort. And we need to just come to terms with that fact, explicitly teach something, and systematically teach it. And I even in my executive function curriculum with EXQ, one of the things that we say, teach executive function as explicitly, systematically, and in a personalized way to all children, and don't wait for a disorder, disability, or difficulty. Yeah. Because by design, you're going to have a difficulty because you're doing something challenging. Otherwise, you won't be having difficulty.
Yeah.
So as we close out, what are I had a question about this, which is one of my favorite book series was Series of Unfortunate Events with Lemony Snicket. One of the most famous things he did, which was always have higher order vocabulary words with an explanation as if, so he kind of aided children reading by using like a meta, like, let me explain, but Violet is explaining or something. I forget now but I loved books that introduced concepts and didn't leave the younger reader stranded, but kind of aided them along the way. And that's really, my children were totally hooked on it and obsessed about it. And we stood in line once for close to 5 hours to get his signature.
Oh, wow.
When my son was in 3rd grade, and he had come. So from 3 p.m. until 11 p.m. we stood in line. So what are your thoughts what's a great, do you have an author or that has done a good job of roping children in to engage them? And of course, there's so many of them. So really don't mean to put you on the spot, but just curious what you think about that.
Well, I mean, I think the wonderful thing is there has been such a boon in young adult literature. I mean, there was young adult literature when I was a kid, but, we did live through a little...
I mean, Nancy Drew.
Yeah. I mean, Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys and all that kind of stuff. But, wow, we really lived through a really interesting period when you had Harry Potter. And I mean, when you think about the number of kids that started reading that didn't read anything else, and then you transitioned into, I forget the exact order, but I know we had the whole vampire series, and then we had the Hunger Games, we've had these novels that were just so different and so compelling that just massive numbers of kids were willing to trust that author. I think there's just so much good stuff. I would, if I could give a short recommendation to people, what I would say is this independent reading piece, which, I mean, we want kids to read independently. Don't sweat the details ever so much about what it is they're reading if they're reading and they're happy.
So good.
You know, a guy
So
that I
good.
work,
Yeah.
and I wrote a blog about this called "Why Reluctant Readers." I didn't say struggling, because not every struggling reader is reluctant. You know, sometimes there are kids that can read, not every reluctant reader is a struggling reader. But I wrote a blog titled "Why Reluctant Readers Need Authors They Can Trust." And
love
actually,
that.
it was pretty clear. I mean, it was related to Judy Blume.
My favorite.
And
Yes.
it was one of my colleagues who, when they started an independent reading program, his middle school kid, who was a very high-scoring reader, all he'd read was Judy Blume. So the dad's all frustrated. My kid's reading Judy Blume. Shouldn't he be reading something more important? And he said, I walked into the library because the library was doing this reading motivation program, and the kid kept coming home with Judy Blume books. And he said, I walked into the library, and I was going to give that librarian a piece of my mind. Now, he's principal, so he knew her, so he could kind of say these things. And he said, she held up her hand, and she said, stop in your tracks. I know why you're here about the Judy Blume books. You think you ought to be reading something more. And she said, let me tell you something. Leave him alone.
Aw.
He's never willingly read anything else before, and he's reading all of those books. And then she paused for a second and said, besides, we only got 2 more Judy Blume books in the library. So
Then what is he going to do next?
Well, what he did is he found 3 more in the local county library. But in that moment,
But look at the motivation and
the
persistence.
motivation, because
Amazing.
later on, what my colleague said was, that was the best advice that anybody ever gave me about my own child that I was
love
ever
that.
given. I needed to leave him alone. Let's not worry too much, particularly when a kid's never read before. I mean, I had high school kids that, when I taught senior English, that walked up to me with, the first book of Harry Potter, which didn't have the highest readability level. And they say, Mr. Kerns, can I read this? I know it's a little bit below my ideal reading zone, but can I read this? The last thing I was ever going to say was no. I mean, are you kidding me? I'd have been crazy. So, what we say is manage your kids' independent reading practice, but not too rigidly.
I love that. And, my parallel is I worked with a lot of children with ADHD. One of the things that I saw, reluctance to read because of attention. And also, I think having very unique interests and not finding anything to read about or cared about or nobody was talking about in the academic context. I had a kid who was obsessed with Captain Underpants. And the parents were getting really annoyed because
how many more of those books can come home?
Exactly. And also it looked a little juvenile. And I'm he's enjoying it. When have you seen him sit and finish a whole book in one sit? Isn't that something worthy of celebrating?
I had a middle school kid that read Goosebumps books like candy. And I mean, we had eventually we negotiated. We're like, okay, for every 2 Goosebumps books, you're going to read one other thing. But this was a kid that wasn't a reader. And the teacher said he reads a book a night.
Isn't
he comes
that amazing?
in every day excited to tell me about what he's reading. Leave him alone. Eventually he'll grow out of, he'll find something else that want to be something else, and remember 3 kinds of reading. He's still going to do the academic reading, the reading to, reading with, I'm going to do the reading to. This is just part of it. So, know when to jump in and manage it as you can, and know when you just need to back off. And for a kid that's never read, when they find an author they trust, let them go with it and ride that train as far as it'll take them.
Jean, I could talk with you forever, and keeping my listeners' needs, we might have to end our conversation. So as you were very generous last time in recommending some books, is there anything top of the mind when it comes to literacy research that you would like to highlight? And you have mentioned a lot of fun books for young adults as well, which is always nice.
My book was profoundly impacted by The Reading Mind, which we already mentioned, Daniel Willingham's book.
Yes.
And Dahan, Dahan gets a little bit more advanced. So if you read Willingham and you want to read something more advanced, go to Dahan. Don't start with Dahan. That's hard. That's going deeper in the water. But hey, it's an example. Willingham gave you background knowledge that allowed you to then engage with Dahan. The other one that was really important for me was Edie Hirsch's book, Why Knowledge Matters. So
I saw you quoted her a lot. So
it's a him.
Oh, Edie.
And then Wexler, you're probably thinking also,
Wexler.
right? So if you like Natalie Wexler's book, The Knowledge Gap, that's out there. They're both very similar. They go in different directions. Wexler says, here's the research, here's what it means for curriculum. Edie Hirsch more so says, here's the research, here's what it means for policy and assessment. So they begin with the same base, and then they just go in different directions. But my book, if it wasn't for Willingham's book, in E.D. Hirsch's book, I probably wouldn't have written what I wrote. But there were just so many good ideas that needed to be pulled together and shared. That's why we did it.
I really recommend this book for all those educators because I think I love that it's very, very research based, but it's so practical. Every section has guidance.
That's what we try for.
You have immediately you will be able to apply it. So you don't need to do that like, when I start the year, I'll think about it. And parents, if you're just nerds like me, then you will enjoy it because even the young forming brains, I think it's so interesting. If you are not in the field that I am as a parent, you never think about vocabulary or phonics or anything. You're not even thinking about knowledge. You're just saying read and grow. So this is really, really helpful. Well, thank you so much for being here today, Jean. Thank you, audiences, for tuning in. Once again, thank you for considering Full Prefrontal, Exposing the Mysteries of Executive Function as your go-to podcast. Please share this podcast. We will be linking to a lot of resources that Jean has mentioned and his own writings. And keep in touch. Share this podcast with loved ones, your family, friends, and always, always let that brain grow. So thank you for joining.
Thank you for listening to Full Prefrontal, Exposing the Mysteries of Executive Function. To contact your host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive function, visit her website at exqinfiniteknowhow.com. That's www.exqinfiniteknowhow.com. Tune in next week for another informative episode of Full Prefrontal, hosted by the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.